Hey, welcome back everybody. This is the next segment of the LS1 build, probably the last video, I would imagine. Today we're going to talk about the front covers. This is probably the most critical part. If you remember last time, we got kind of the bottom end buttoned up, we put the windage tray on and the pickup tube, and now we're going to talk about these front covers. The front covers have to be perfectly centered to the hub on the balancer and the back to the crankshaft, and so it's pretty critical. We actually have, GM has special tools. You can use the balancer to do this by putting the balancer in, leave the bolts loose and just kind of center it. That seems to work pretty good if you're careful. I've actually had a couple of engines where they leaked when the guys did that. I'm going to show you the proper way to do it according to GM. I've got the GM tools here, but again, centering these covers is probably the most critical part and probably one of the more difficult things that you'll do. And it's actually not difficult, I shouldn't say that. It's just, if you got the right tools, it's a piece of cake. So we're going to start with the front cover. Now on the front cover, you can press the front seal in with the seal tool. The kit has this seal installation tool. It goes here, it just fits inside. And I just put this on my press, and it doesn't take much. I lubricate the outside of the seal, and you just very gently press that in. You don't want to pound it in with a hammer or anything. Use the tool. Or you can put this on the engine without the seal, and you can actually press the seal in on the engine. I just put it on first. On the front of the engine here, there's a couple ways to do this. What I do, you notice I use a little bit of silicone sealer on this gasket. You don't really need to do it to seal this thing, and that's not why I'm doing it. I do it because I just put the bolts in because I want the gasket to adhere to the block. That's the only reason I'm doing it. The rubber and the neoprene enforced gaskets that Felpro has for the LS1 and even the factory gaskets, you don't really need sealer on these. But I just do it because now I've had this sitting on here with the bolts in it for like 45 minutes. So I know that the gasket's not going to move. That's the way I do it. You can do it however you want, but this is the way I would advise it, okay? So let me get these bolts out. Voila, the bolts are magically out. Now, we want to focus in on the tools that we're going to use on this cover. So what you want to do is you want to go ahead and get your cover on there. This is our front cover here. Go ahead and get your cover on and just get all your bolts started, but you do not want to tighten these bolts yet. You want to just get these in finger tight. Okay, so we just took all the bolts out. We're going to magically put them all back in, and voila, the bolts are back in. But again, not tight. Now you see how much movement this cover has, so we want the bolts just finger tight, just up enough to where the cover can still move around like that. Now, you probably guessed already, with that cover moving around like that, it's going to be very difficult to eyeball that and get it centered. Like I said earlier, you can put the balancer on and use that and tighten it up. We're going to use the GM tools today. So this is the tool that goes on the oil pan flange and this mating surface for the pan here, and this cutout here is for the pickup tube. So there's 4 bolts that go in here, 2 into the block and then 2 into the cover. You want to go ahead and put this on, and we're going to tighten the tool onto the block. So we're just going to take our bolts here, go ahead and get all 4 of them in. Now here's the deal, guys. You want to put some kind of a spacer on here, because without the pan on here, these bolts are actually too long and they won't tighten up. Secured to the block, let's get them good and tight, good and snug. GM says to torque them, but you can just get them good and snug, it's fine. Now you can see our plate is still moving. So you want to run these in. I still want to be able to move that cover. You can see it's moving. All right, now once you get to that point, we're going to put our crank tool in. So this is the tool you're going to need for centering that cover on the crank. If you look at this cover, you can see There's a couple of machined areas right here, and that's where this tool goes. So this tool just slides onto the crankshaft, and it's going to go right onto that machined area, that gauge point there. You're going to put the tool right there. Then you're going to go ahead and secure the tool with the crank bolt. Now remember, very important here, only tighten this finger tight. You don't want to go any tighter than that. That's all that's required. Finger tight. Just go in until it's snug. Okay. Now what we want to do is we want to tighten these bolts on the top here, bolts that are going into the cover. So let's go ahead and tighten these up. Get them snug, good and tight. If you feel like you need to, you can torque these to spec. I've been doing this for so long, I know about how tight to get it. Okay, now your cover is secured and centered to where it needs to be. Now at this point, we need to torque our timing cover bolts. What I urge you to do here, guys, is tighten these bolts in sequence to the proper torque. Start in the center, and you want to work your way to the outside. And remember, we've got our plate secure, we've got our centering tool secure, and now we're going to torque these. Alright, so the torque on these is 18 foot-pounds. Okay, so your torque on these is 18 foot-pounds. You want to start in the middle with these middle bolts here. So we're just going to run this in. Before we torque them, just run these down until they're just snug. Just so it kind of pulls the cover up. And you want to alternate. Start in the middle and go toward the outside. And remember, I'm not torquing these yet. I'm just pulling the cover up to where it's flush with the block with just a tiny bit of tension. Okay, so I've got these bolts basically just snugged up. Now we're going to torque the bolts in sequence to 18 foot-pounds. Really important, guys, use a torque wrench. Do not over tighten this cover because it will leak. Okay, we're going to start here. 18 foot-pounds is not much. That's it right there. Okay, we're going to come down here. Back up in this corner on the lower side. Then we're going to come back down here. With the type of gasket technology that these newer engines have, the LS included, it's actually really important that you torque these things to the right spec. Over tightening these gaskets will make them leak almost every time. Now that you've got that done, you want to just go through and make sure they're all torqued, you didn't miss anything. You don't actually have to go in sequence because they're already torqued. We're just going to double check. Now we can take our alignment tools off, and there's one more check, you guys, that you got to make sure that this installation is correct. There's one check here, one spec that's really critical. So go ahead and just take your tools off. You might have to, sometimes this will be a little bit snug in there. You might have to loosen up the bolts on your alignment plate up here and on the block. So go ahead and get those loose. My plate's loose. Tool comes right off. Okay, so this is the proper procedure. Again, there's other ways to do it, but I wanted to show you guys the way the GM does it. Okay, so now we can remove our plate, and we're going to do our final check here. Get your plate off, set the bolts aside. Now, the specification that GM gives is 0.5 millimeter, or for those of you that are Americans, the cover cannot be more than 20 thousandths lower or higher than the pan rail here, okay? It should be slightly lower, but we can't have a variation of more than 20 thousandths or a step of 20 thousandths here. So we're going to take a straight edge and a set of feeler gauges, and we're going to check that. This is critical, that we don't have too much of a gap here, because that's going to cause you a problem when you put the oil pan on. So I'm going to get my 20 thousandths feeler gauge, which is what's the maximum allowable, and I'm just going to check and make sure that that doesn't go in there, and it doesn't. It is not even close to going in. I'm going to grab a feeler gauge that is half of that, if I could see it here, just to verify. So there's 10 thousandths, okay? And I'm going to see if 10 will go in. 10 is not even going in. So I don't even have half of the gap that I'm allowed, which is good. That's what you want. We're going to go to the other side, and we're going to check and make sure this installation is really good. Now, the one thing that they tell you is that if you get a cover or a situation between the cover and the pan rail here, and you can't get that thing to go flush, in other words, you've got more than 20 thousandths gap here, that means that something's wrong here and you got to replace the cover. Now, honestly, the way that they did the covers on this motor is a pain in the butt. It really is. I mean, I think they could have easily put dowel pins in this and made it like the early small block Chevy. That's one area where the early small block Chevy, I mean, we don't have to have all these special tools and stuff to build it, or you don't have to go through all this procedure. But honestly, I mean, it's not that bad. It's just one little irritation to me that I wish GM would have just doweled this like the other engine. Then you could just put it on and boom, be done with it. But you know, it is what it is. All right, so let's go to the rear of the engine, because there is a little bit of a difference on the rear. There's a learning curve. We're going to use the same plate. This plate is universal. It's for the front and the back. So, but I am going to have to take the engine off of the stand to do this, because I can't get to the back of the motor with it on the stand. So I'm going to turn the camera off, and I'm going to get this up on the bench, and we're talking about the back of the motor. All right, you guys, so we're in the back of the engine now, and off camera I went ahead and I put just a little bit of the tacky sealer on there, put the bolts in it, let it sit, so our gasket is adhered to the block. I just like to do that. Again, they don't require any sealer on this, but I just put a little bit on so that the gasket stays in place. Now, you got a couple of oil gallery plugs here for the lifter bores. That is sealed off by this seal, and the rear cam, the cam is also sealed by the gasket. So there's no plug or anything, there's no plugs in here. However, there is one oil gallery plug, and you don't want to forget to put it in, and that's this one here. You remember when we took it apart, we pulled that plastic piece out. So this is our oil gallery plug. It's got an O-ring on it, and GM says you can actually reuse the O-ring if it's in good shape, but I went ahead and put a new one on it. And you also want to put just a little dab of oil on that O-ring. We got some assembly lube here, so we're just going to dab it on there. And then this plug just basically pops right into that hole. Slide that gallery plug right into the hole, right up until it is flush. It'll pop in. You want to make sure you put that in. If you don't put this in here, you're going to have a big problem with oil pressure. You want to go ahead and get this on. Now this cover, the thing about the rear cover is this thing has to go on without the seal. GM requires the seal installation to be done after the cover is installed and centered. And so we're just going to get our bolts in. Once we get all our bolts in, again, we're going to put our fixtures on here. Get the bolts in, but don't tighten them up yet. Alright, so we've got the bolts in. You can see, same situation here. We got movement on this cover. Go ahead and take your plate and put it on just like you did on the front. We're going to tighten it to the block and we're going to leave it loose. We're going to put the cover bolts in here, but we're not going to tighten those up just yet. Alright guys, so a couple things that are important here. Now remember, our cover's still loose. We've got the block bolts tight. When you get this on, make sure that this is parallel to the crankshaft pan rail here. That's pretty important. And this thing's kind of a snug fit. To get these over the crank flange down here, you might have to take a soft hammer and kind of tap it a little bit to get these fingers just to separate just a little bit. It is a tight fit, but it's designed that way, and you just want to run these in evenly until you're just snug in there. You just want to snug it up. You don't over tighten these. Okay, just get them up till they're snug. Just kind of work your way back and forth. And what this is doing, now that we've got that in there, that is centering that cover. Okay, now that centers it this way. That's why you want this like this. You don't want the crank bolts this way. We're centering it side to side here with this fixture, and then we're just going to pull it up into place with our plate by just snugging these two bolts up here on top. So now we're going to snug the bolts going into the cover right up on top. Just go ahead and snug the two cover bolts up. Make sure that these are just snug. These are good. And that's your alignment. Now we can go ahead and torque our bolts in sequence, and again we're going to start in the center, and the torque specification is the same. It's 18 foot-pounds back here, or you can convert that to inch-pounds if you're using the inch-pound torque wrench. But I'm going to do what I did in the front. I'm just going to go ahead and just get these flush. I'm not torquing them to specs yet. I'm just running them up till they're just pulling that cover up against the block. Same thing on the rear cover, guys. 18 foot-pounds. Start in the middle. Work your way to the bottom and the top, alternating to both sides. Once again, just go over every one of them. Make sure you didn't miss anything. And that's really all there is to it, guys. So I recommend that you use the GM tools, mainly because it just makes it that much easier. And like I said, this is a pretty critical check. You could have, I mean, I've seen guys do this the other way and had a pretty severe leak. So just follow those instructions. And you know, when I first started doing these years ago, I was like, man, this is a big giant pain in the keister, you know. But man, I've done so many of these things, and it's just, it's not that hard. It actually is really pretty easy to do. The tools make it a lot easier. I want to go ahead and put that seal in because there is a seal installer that goes here. So let me show you how we put that in. I'll get this stuff off and we'll put that seal in. All right, you guys, so we've got the seal kind of started in there, but in order to get that in, we have a special seal driver that goes on here, and this goes onto the crankshaft. And the same two bolts that you used for the alignment tool, you're going to use in this. So just go ahead and get your bolts in this. And you don't need to really have these too tight. Just snug them up with a screwdriver. And this piece is threaded in here, and you've got, this actually catches the lip of that seal on the outside of it, and it's actually designed to expand that seal as you put it in to give it a better seal. So it is actually kind of important that you use this tool. So we just get this guy started here. And you can see as we go in here, this is going to evenly pull that seal in until it's flush. You really don't want to like take a hammer and pound these seals in or anything. If you do, there's a good chance it's going to leak. So we just want to go ahead and go in until it's flush. And once that's flush, take your tool off, and voila, you have installed your seal. And you can see where that seal's located. There's a chamfer on this cover. You can see that there's a chamfer right here. That seal gets pushed all the way down to the flat spot inside that chamfer, and that is how it's supposed to be installed. And that's it. That's rear cover and front cover installation. Now, one other thing that I would mention here, really important, the same issue with alignment on top here. So you want to take your straight edge and your feeler gauges and make sure that you don't have, you're only allowed to have a maximum of 20 thousandths difference here between the cover and the pan rail. And I can tell you right now, we don't have anywhere near that. So I'm just going to take like 6 thousandths here, because I can see this is really flush. And we got literally no variation there. Same thing on the other side. We're allowed 20 maximum, and we don't even have 6. So our cover installation is really, really good on this motor. Now, one other thing that I would mention, I am actually not going to put the oil pan on this engine because the customer is using a custom oil pan because of his swap that he's doing. So, but I do want to show you the pan because there is an issue with the pan in the back of the engine here. Now this pan's not going to be used. The factory pan has a little rivet here that holds this gasket on. That is simply for ease of assembly. The new gasket doesn't require that. The new gasket simply goes onto the block and it doesn't have that attaching rivet. So you can just kind of drill or knock that rivet out there. I'm not going to do it because we're not using this pan. I want to show you this with the gasket on. I don't want to put the new gasket on it. So when you put your pan on, the pan goes onto the block, and once you get your bolts in, what's really important here is the pan, just like these covers, it has movement. You can see I can pull it out and it protrudes. When this pan is on and bolted down, it cannot protrude out past this cover. If it does, the way that the LS bell housing and so forth torques onto this, if you have this cover out here and the customer goes to torque this together, or you go to torque it together, it's going to damage that bell housing. It could crack it. It can also damage the pan. So once you get the pan on and your gasket, you need to take a straight edge this way, and you need to make sure that you have clearance, right? We're going to put this straight edge right here. That pan actually needs to be inboard slightly of this cover. There's a spec for that, and I usually want it inboard probably 10 or 15 thousandths, right? So the pan needs to be pushed up that way, and it cannot protrude past this. And I'll check that with feeler gauges. So just be aware of that. You can look up the specs in the book for your particular application, but the pan installation is critical as far as where it's located. If it's protruding past this cover and you can't get it to go that way, something is wrong. You're going to have to figure that out. Whatever you do, don't just say, send it, it'll be fine. So But you need to look, that's something wrong if that happens. So, but that's basically it. But like I said, I'm not putting this pan on. Okay, I'm gonna get it back off of the bench. I'm gonna get it back onto the stand, and then I will talk to you about this valve train, because the valve train has to go on this thing, but I have to get it on the pan and flip it upside down in order to do that. So I'll turn the camera off and we'll get that started. All right, guys, so one other thing that I would mention here is the balancer. There's no keyway on the balancer on the LS. It's fine because it's a neutral balance, unless you're doing an Corvette engine. Now, Corvette, the balancer is going to have a couple of balance pins in it. You got to make sure that goes on exactly how you took it off if you're doing a Corvette engine. This is not. This is just a neutral balance. So it'll go on anyway. But the thing is, like the GM tool, the nice thing is it has this step here. It's pretty important where this balancer goes. In other words, how deep you put it on. You actually have to measure the depth from the flat spot of your balancer here to the crankshaft. So you're gonna have to make sure you get that depth right. And by all means, get an installation tool if you don't have this one. Don't ever beat this balancer on. I've seen guys take a hammer and beat that thing on there. Man, I mean, don't do that. That does a lot of damage to the thrust bearing in the motor. Okay, so once you get that done, and of course, I just put the pan on, and it's just held on here with a couple bolts because I wanted to protect everything down here. So let's flip this thing over, and I want to talk to you about the valve train. Once we get the valve train installed and the valley pan, this thing's pretty much done. All right, now on your valley pan, guys, these are knock sensor seals. Make sure you put the new ones in there. You got to kind of tap those in with a soft hammer. It's kind of a press fit. Doesn't take too much, but just lay this on the bench and just gently tap those in. Put a little oil on them. And you also want to oil the area here where the knock sensor goes in. You just take a little dab of oil on your finger and lube those up. And then go ahead and put your cover on. These just go right down over the knock sensor provisions, and they're going to fit snug on there. So you just kind of push that down, and that'll seal in there. And then of course get your bolts in and torque them. On your rocker assembly, guys, you have a base plate here, and it's got some writing on it. Just make sure that that writing is upright. It says GM right there. Make sure the GM and the stuff's not upside down. It goes on like this, and the GM logo should be right side up. We kept our rockers in order. You also want to put a little bit of oil on the threads of the rocker bolt. So we kept the rockers in order on this thing, so don't have any problems. Oh, and a dab of assembly lube on the valve tip and engine oil on the push rod. And then just go ahead and get your rockers started. Don't tighten any of them down yet. Just go ahead and get them all in there, and then we'll talk about, once I get them in, I'll show you how we're going to tighten these down. So here's the dealio. When it comes to the rocker arms being torqued down, this is a non-adjustable valve train. There's no adjustment on it. But what GM wants you to do is they want you to be on the base circle for that particular cylinder. So these rockers are all loose now, none of them are tight. So we're going to start with this one here, and we're going to watch our valves. This is our intake valve here, and this is our exhaust. So the intake valve is going to open. So there it goes. It's opening, and it's not really opening because the rocker's not tight, but it's going to come up right after the intake valve opens, and then it closes. This thing went back down. That kind of puts those two on their base circle, and that's where they want you to torque these bolts down. They just want you to run these down until they're snug. And I'm not going to torque them right now. I'll go back and torque them all. I'm just going to snug them up, and then I'll go back and torque each one of them to spec. As long as they're snugged up like that, that's fine. And you can just go through all the rockers like that. Watch your intake valve. The push rod's going to rise and fall. Once it falls back down, and you might want to put your hand on it. So I'll give you an example of that. So here's the intake for this one here. And right now it's down. So if you watch this, as I rotate the engine, that's going to come up at some point. There's the exhaust. So I'm just going to push that exhaust back down. Now my intake is opening. There goes your intake. Put your hand on this and push it back down. There's no tension on it, so it might stay up. So just push it back down. Now that that intake has closed, like I said a minute ago, run those down till they're snug. Just get it a little snug. You don't got to torque it. And that way what you're doing is when you tighten these down, you're torquing that aluminum rail down evenly. Otherwise, if you try to torque this down with the valve wide open, it could snap that plate. You don't want to do that. You don't want to put undue stress on it. So that's basically it. So just go through all the rockers like that. Once you get them all snugged down, then you can go through and just torque them to spec. And that's your rocker installation. So that is really it for this engine. I mean, that's, if you think about it, I mean, I've done so many of these and I don't really think about it too much, but I was thinking about it yesterday and I thought, man, you know, between building an early small block and building an LS, there's really not a lot of difference. In fact, the LS, once you actually get the procedure down and you get the tools and stuff, it's actually honestly a little bit easier. When you go to put in the car, it's a lot easier too, because we got a dry manifold. Put the manifold on either way, you can flip it around and the manifolds will go on either side, upside down, whatever, it doesn't matter. Everything's like ambidextrous on this motor and interchangeable from side to side, front to back. So just a phenomenal engine. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed this aspect of it. I think there's a possibility we may put this on the dyno. I don't know yet. I'm still trying to work the logistics of that out. But if we do, that'll be tacked onto the video. That'll be the next thing you see, because basically we've got, you know, the long block done. Everything else is pretty straightforward, putting the intake and the water pump and all that stuff on. I mean, I don't really feel like I need to show all that, because I mean, it's basically, you know, plug and play stuff. Coil on plug and all that stuff. Pretty simple stuff. So I appreciate you watching, and hopefully we'll get this on the dyno and we'll have that coming up next.